Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Bon dia. Hold on. Here we go. There was a little complexity just then. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Bon dia, depending on where you are on this planet. It's a fast forward planet, an overheating planet, a war torn planet, and anyone who thinks Putin's war in Ukraine is just in Ukraine has has some headlines to look at to see just how big the impact is right here. Uh, Colleague of mine from my days at National Geographic, Haley Kreider, was just tweeting a story, a Bloomberg story, showing global shortages are pushing food producers back toward palm oil. And what this means is there's a fight over palm oil is both an energy source and a food source, and it's in areas that are in many parts of the world indigenous. So you can see more of that conflict. These disruptions are going to play out even more. But today we're going to focus. This is the Friday afternoon journalistic review of headlines, trying to get some of the deeper thoughts behind the bullet points that you're all bathed in online. I'm Andy Revkin, a longtime journalist, also at the Columbia Climate School, where I run an initiative on communication and sustainability. Back in 1989, I spent 4 months in Brazil, 3 of them in the Amazon, piecing together the tragic story of the killing of Chico Mendes, who was a Brazilian uh, rubber tapper and union organizer who was murdered for pursuing land rights for his people, and often in concert and alliance with the other peoples of the forest, indigenous communities. So the events of this past 2 weeks feel far too familiar. And I'm really glad to have two guests on today from Brazil who are going to fill you in a little bit on their reactions to the story of the moment down there, which is the slaying, now clear, the murder and dismemberment and destruction of the bodies of two really noteworthy champions of indigenous rights to exist safely. One a journalist and one an indigenous. This is called he had worked at FUNAI, the Indian agency in Brazil, and had been on leave there. He served as a guide for the journalist Dom Phillips, writing mainly for The Guardian. Uh, and from all accounts of people who knew him, I never met him, uh, a wonderful journalist devoted to reality. And this right now and talk a little bit about where the story is at and where we're going from here. And I wanted to greet Carla Mendez, who writes at mangabay.com. Mangabay is a fantastic global resource for anyone trying to keep track of forest and sustainability issues. Carla, you're based in Brazil, and Lucy Jordan, who's at Unearthed, which is a publication of Greenpeace. You're about to move to Washington, D.C., but you've been based in Brazil. And you both wrote pieces about reflecting on this horrific incident. Maybe we'll just start with tell the audience a little bit about who you are, why you write about what you write about, and then we'll get into the details of this case. Again, thank you for being here. Maybe we'll start with Carla. So what drew you to be covering these issues, Carla? And what do you think about each day when you're thinking about the environment, society, sustainability? And we'll get to you in a second, Lucy, and then we'll get into the story.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Andy. It's really important for us to keep spreading the word about this tragedy. We in Brazil are all heartbroken about this tragedy involving Don and Bruno, and of course, people all around the world. And since I learned what they were missing, it's really disturbing. And then since then I started trying to write something, and then it was really tough because, as I reported in my op-ed to Monga Bay, a real movie started to play in my mind, because what happened to them could have happened to any of us who are in the front lines and reporting in the Amazon, because you've been there, and whoever have been there knows that there is no 100% security. And in many times you just take the risk to tell the truth, to uncover the wrongdoing. But then I said, no, let me reunite strength and write a tribute to them, and also to kind of, it's also a way to unite the community, and spread the word and trying to be stronger together to keep fighting for the environment. I'm based in Rio de Janeiro. I've been working for Monga Bay for 3 years, and in the environmental beat. I've been for 6 years. Before that, I was a business reporter. So it was a huge transition in my career. But
Yeah.
it's all connected because it's all about money, all these environmental crimes and wrongdoing we see. So
Right.
it's really helpful. So yeah, I'm really glad to be here.
That's great. And we'll talk about those, the relationship to commerce, both illegal and legal commerce, in a couple of minutes. So, Lucy Jordan, again, what brought you to Brazil initially? And you're at Greenpeace, uh, pursuing a journalistic enterprise. Uh, what brought you to that, as opposed to so many other questions that you could be digging in on?
Yeah, I first came to Brazil in 2012 as a clueless freelancer, and I was in
I doubt
Brasilia.
that.
And I'd worked in Cambodia for a year actually, where I kind of wanted to get into environmental issues, but I was never really didn't really know where to start. And then I moved to Brazil because of my partner's job, and I arrived in Brasilia, and Dom actually kind of got me my first proper job in Brasilia. What a job! It was we worked at Platts together, which is an oil and gas energy newswire. So I was
Mhm.
kind of doing business reporting to Carla, and we worked together doing oil and gas and energy reporting for Platts for probably a year and a half or so, I think. So not environmental originally, but it was always something that interested me. And when I was doing I always talk about Platts and that it kind of was my bread and butter. Both Dom and I at that point would say that, we do this oil and gas reporting because it pays our way, and then we can do kind of features and other stuff in our spare time. So I did a few bits of environmental stuff there, but not full time or anything. But I think it was really living in Brazil with it's hard to live in Brazil and not become very acutely aware of the environment, because it has such a wealth of natural resources, and those natural resources are the center of so many interesting and troubling dynamics, historically as well as in the present, and so many injustices, land inequity and racial injustice from the legacy of sugarcane slavery, and then covering oil and gas. You think about the massive oil reserves, and then looking at the energy matrix more broadly, it's all about hydro. And it's just a country where its natural resources are very rich, but also very central to so many interesting journalistic stories. So I was in Brazil for a few years, and I did a bit of environment, but not as much as I'd like to, but I kind of got the bug. And then I left and worked for Greenpeace in London. And then when the opportunity to come back to Brazil, to Sao Paulo, arose in 2019, I decided to kind of try and focus in on that. And luckily, well, not luckily, 2019 happened to be the most important time in reporting in environmental issues in Brazil in recent years because of Bolsonaro. So that's what I've been doing ever since.
Yeah, and Carla, back to you. What was it like for you when Bolsonaro was elected? I did a piece for National Geographic at that time, and you know, there's always that. He had a what was it? It was a very ruralista campaign. He was really focused on getting that rural vote, and so much of it reminded me of Trump in the way he would the populism. For Bolsonaro, it was bullets, Bible, and beef. Right, beef, bullets, and Bible was his campaign platform. And so, how has it felt as it's played out? Especially this past year.
Yeah, no, it's been 4-year nightmare since then. When I was living in Rio already, and then I was closely following, when they did the ousted Dilma Rousseff. It was completely unbelievable, the coup, and then when I was following the elections and seeing that he could win, I said, my God, it's not going to happen. And then I was still hopeful. And then it was a really, really sad day. I cried a lot that day. Then I started being desperate because I was really concerned about censorship and security for journalists because he clearly hates journalists and attacks them, and also all his speech against indigenous rights and against all traditional communities. So I clearly remember that, I first of all, I thought that maybe I would need to leave the country and stuff, but then I said, no, I need to stay and keep fighting because we need to resist. And traditional communities and the environment needs us more than ever. So, but it's been really tough times. And when you think that, the worst things had already happened, and then we are surprised by worse and worse things. So it's been really tough times. Hopefully, in the upcoming election in October, this will come to an end. And I clearly remember because in January 19 was when I did a documentary film. At the time, I was freelancing. I just finished my contract with the Thomson Reuters Foundation, but then I was freelancing before joining Monga Bay. And then I did a documentary film where Bruno is featured. And,
oh, really? No, it just
yeah.
was a thing, yeah.
Yeah, the documentary film about the Guardians of the Forest, who are a group of Guajajara indigenous in northeastern Maranhão state. And then we went there and followed their patrol and their fight against illegal loggers. And so after that, we went to Brasilia. And I remember that Funai was the very, very last interview we got because I was trying to get the interviews. I had a really short time to do. And I was talking to my contacts. I lived in Brasilia as well as Lucy, but at the time I was a business reporter. And that's funny that you mentioned Platts. I worked for S&P Global. So, you are a coincidence because they're all from the same group now. But for them, I covered, insurance and banks. But in Brasilia, I followed all the big developments. For example, Belo Monte Dam and all this stuff. And I remember, that there was always this fight against the traditional communities. But at the time where I was looking at it from a different perspective, but it always bothered me how things were treated when you talk about the rights of the community. So that's why I decided to change completely my career. And so I mean, it's been, that's the movie. And when I was writing this op-ed yesterday, because I didn't realize that before, I said, my God, the second person featured in the documentary film who is murdered, because in that film we followed the patrol, and then I was there in January. The movie was released in May 2019, and then in November, Paulo Paulino Guajajara was brutally murdered, allegedly by illegal loggers. I was completely disturbed for several months without sleeping, imagine. So it was really devastating. And Bruno is in that documentary film, I remember that I was trying to get the interviews, and then, people know me there in Brazil. In the very last minute, we got it. And then he was brilliant in giving us all his knowledge about the Guardians. So, wow. And then yesterday when I was writing the op-ed, and then I remember Dom Phillips, when I was doing research, I found his story at the time for the Washington Post in 2015 about the Guardians. And when we released the documentary film, and it won 3 international awards in film festivals, and both film festivals and journalism awards, he reached out to me, he praised me, he shared it, So I thought, my God, what's going on? They were all connected. They were all warriors and guardians of the forest, and they've been killed. That's wrong. We cannot stop, and we need to keep fighting to defend the environment and also to honor their memory and their fight.
Bruno, when you were interviewing the interviews, or just what he was like? And Lucy, the same for you, for Dom or Bruno.
I think as everyone who knew Dom has testified, he's just an incredibly nice man. I mean, I wasn't, we weren't best friends or anything, but we stayed in touch since our Platt days, and he was always just very kind. Even in the way we met, like I say, I looked through our emails from those Platt days a couple of days ago, and there's just so many to take on this young woman who doesn't know anything about oil and gas, and he trusted me and taught me how to do it all, and he didn't need to be that patient. And I think, as I said in the op-ed, and as so many people have said, he was always so curious about people's stories, and so kind-hearted and generous of spirit, and his reporting was really shaped by that. Like he wanted to tell the stories of vulnerable communities and underreported stories and marginalized peoples, and he cared deeply about the Amazon and about indigenous people. And he was a very kind man.
And it's interesting looking at his career, because he came out of like writing about pop music, DJs, and he gravitated to this beat and stuck with it right through to the end in a way that was really interesting for me to look at. And
yeah, he came to write about superstar Brazilian DJs in the drum and bass scene. We bonded over that a little bit when I first came, because I had my drum and bass days too. But even when I first met him, when he had been here for a few years, but I think I remember him saying, there was at that time, it was 2012, and all the stories about Brazil were like booming Brazil, part of the BRICS, people are coming back, people who've emigrated away from Brazil are coming back because Brazil's booming, everything's going great. And there were lots of kind of foreign correspondents arriving at about the same time as me to cover that, and to cover the World Cup and the Olympics. And but I think Dom, even at that point, kind of said, no, I don't think I'm going to leave. Now I'm here. Brazil's the place for me. I think, he wasn't a helicopter journalist. He came, right. He was Brazilian. This was home for him.
So where do you think this will go? Again, thinking back to Chico Mendes and some of the other violence I've covered over the years in these resource frontiers, unfortunately, the media still too often focus on the case, the investigation, the trial, and then move on, because it's really hard to build a story around these systemic questions. The power base, the role of big agriculture, the culture. There was a guy, an anthropologist, his last name is Hoelle, who's lived in Acre, where I did a lot of my reporting. He's American, but he wrote a book called Rainforest Cowboys about the sort of ruralista culture. And everything seems still, even without Bolsonaro, you have this sort of pressure in the Amazon that's existed for decades. Back when I was writing in 1980s, it was the Nossa Amazonia. Brazil was expressing concern about losing control of the Amazon, just in terms of geopolitical control, and that the North Americans really had a resource appetite. And there was this other expression, ocupar para no entregar, so occupy so as not to surrender. So it's not even just about the resources, it's about power and control. And then I hear conflicting stories. I haven't been back to the Amazon, in decades, literally. But there's some good news. It felt like that indigenous groups were working with the military in some cases to help, be sort of a guardian presence even for Brazilian military. So I don't know how that's all going to play out. If you could both just give some sense of what the story is going forward, or that urgency, that rage, Lucy, that you talk about. How do you direct that into something that would change those outcomes?
That is the big question. I think, as you pointed out, Andy, that it will take a lot of hard work to change the dynamics that exist. And obviously, this is getting so much international attention now because Dom was a foreign journalist, but there have been many killings of environmental defenders in Brazil,
Totally.
of indigenous leaders. This isn't anything new necessarily. I think the kind of what's new is I think it is a new thing to kill a foreign journalist. I think there has been a measure of insulation that comes with being a foreign journalist in Brazil up until now. So I think I don't think it's a leap to say I think that speaks to an atmosphere of exaggerated impunity, increased impunity, and emboldened ruralista attitude that has seeped down from the statements that come from the top. If you hear the president, if you hear the Minister of the Environment repeatedly disparaging Indigenous rights and repeatedly talking about how they're going to be got rid of, and we're going to legislate to be able to extract resources from Indigenous areas, and we're going to not demarcate a single centimetre more. I think it's reasonable to assume that that's going to have an effect on the way people behave in the day-to-day, and that appears to be borne out in the figures of invasions and deforestation. So I think the question is of how do we change that is a big one, and it would have to be. It's not a quick fix. It requires much more funding going to Obama and ICNBO and the experts who do actually know how to tackle this kind of thing on the ground. There needs to be faith in the institutions again, and there needs to be the political context needs to change. There needs to be a firm, clear rebuttal of the statements and the legislative attempts that Bolsonaro has made to dismantle environmental and indigenous protections. But as you say, these dynamics are also international. There are also transnational, transborder problems to do with agricultural pressure. So that's also something that needs to be addressed. And that is being looked at with some legislation around deforestation, but it doesn't go far enough. It doesn't look at all deforestation in the EU legislation on deforestation, for example, on commodities. The UK legislation just looks at illegal deforestation, not legal, and that's a huge problem. So beef, soy, these are the real pressures that we're seeing. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's all linked, as Carla said. It's all to do with money and business as well. So I don't know. What do you think, Carla?
Yeah. By the way, there's a comment that just came in from climate teacher John J. When Bolsonaro was elected, the Wall Street Journal celebrated the potential for investment, calling it investment sizzle. That sizzle is the sound of the rainforest burning. So that kind of amplifies what you both were just talking about. Yes, so Carla, over to you. And how does this play forward?
Yeah, wow. When we are talking, I remember a lot of cases, I think what we're seeing now is somehow connect to how the occupation of the Brazil, even back after the colonization period came back, occurred. For example, I remember in the Cerrado region, I did a couple of stories there in Mato Grosso do Sul, which dominated by agriculture, and farmers. And there is a big fight there because the indigenous, they simply displaced indigenous people from their ancestral land after the Paraguay War, and then they brought farmers from the south of Brazil and other parts to occupy that land, and then this indigenous people were displaced, and then they are now trying to be back. And I mean, what we see now is a really setback because looks like, you know, what we saw during the military dictatorships happen again, you know, with the thing of development, you know, and the industry and all the things is the good, and all that's natural is, you know, is outdated. And we see many people supporting it. And but of course we need to be hopeful and keep doing our work. I think there is a, unfortunately the changes won't happen fast. First of all, there are a lot of homework to be done, even in Brazil, I can tell you, because Brazil is a big country. I'm Brazilian, and if I tell you about many friends from well-educated, people don't know the reality about the Amazon. They are not aware
Yeah.
of this, you know, and sometimes not their fault because the history was told in a wrong way. Last year, I published a series for Monk Bay. We had a great big team about Brazilian indigenous in Brazilian cities. That's something, they're the most invisible indigenous in the
Right.
country
I
because
remember that
it's
package. Yeah.
yeah, and it was, you know, we had a great feedback about that because people don't know. They just think about the indigenous in the forest, naked, with bow and arrow. So I mean, and the story that is in the books is being told wrong. So first of all, we need to change it, you know. So it's education is something urgent, you know, to change this and to
Exactly.
change this history that's being told in the books. And of course, and I think that international pressure is key because I mentioned it before. It's all about money, and so all importers have to be accountable. So tracking supply chains and giving the name
Exactly.
who is buying, and you are buying products because they cannot say, I'm not aware of this. No, they have to be accountable. And we saw a bunch of examples where when the country said, okay, I won't import commodities from Brazil anymore. So Brazil had to change because it's all about money. So we need to use this monetary pressure for the good.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
But
I have
at the
to.
same time,
Yep.
but when we're talking about the case, of course, of Chico Mendes, Dorothy Stang, that's this impunity is something that really is serious in Brazil because of many, many issues. You know, by the way, we are working on in Monga Bay with the impunity series because we see in Brazil, in Latin American countries, this story repeats. And now this story is gaining more international outreach. But I think that differently from on the time of Chico Mendes and Dorothy Stang, I'm hopeful that internet and social media and all this can be used for the good because now even in some remote areas, indigenous people can show what's happening. In the past,
Right.
only if we could go there. So I think, you know, I'm hopeful that this can be used for the change because the stories and the wrongdoing can come to the surface really fast, and then, you know, as there was reach outcry and demand for action and justice. So yeah, I still prefer to be hopeful, but I know that's a very tough battle.
So I'm very pleased to see Scott Wallace pop into the mix here.
Hi there.
Scott,
Yeah.
thank you so much. I know you were possibly heading down to Brazil. Back there, you had really gone into depth in your reporting in your book on this Javari Valley area
Yeah.
years
Thanks.
ago.
I
And
have to warn you. I'm sorry. Just one quick. It is really crazy here right now, and I might have to jump off at the spur of the moment if a call I'm waiting for comes through. But yeah,
for sure.
pardon me, Andy.
No,
Yeah.
no pardon. So here, just a great meeting with Carla Mendez and Lucy Jordan.
Hi there.
Scott Wallace, who's been on this beat for a very long time for National Geographic and a wonderful book. So Scott, I know you have strong feelings here too, and seeing a fellow journalist slain along with someone like Bruno Pereira is heartbreaking and enraging for all of us. I was looking at the data from the CPJ, Committee to Protect Journalists. There's 923, I guess now it's 924 journalists murdered for doing journalism since 1992. By the way, Lucy, you had been in Cambodia. I was going back through the data. There was a spasm of murders in Cambodia, sort of that 2012 to 2014, logging and illegal fishing too. I covered one of them at the time. I didn't realize there had been so many. So the global commodity issue is just like that. So Scott, what's on your mind and heart right now?
Well, I mean, this whole thing with Bruno and Dom is absolutely heartbreaking. At the same time, it points to, I think, you might say even in a way, a kind of escalation of the attacks, particularly on indigenous people and those who would help them. Bruno was a key figure in helping the people in the Javari Valley defend themselves and organize themselves and effectively deal with mounting invasions of their territory and the theft of their resources. I'm afraid there must be, very much a climate of fear there, and what might follow from this. My hope would be that enough international pressure is applied that the Brazilian government begin to step up and actually, this is a war. This is for most of the world, where the focus may be on the Ukraine and Eastern Europe and that struggle, but as your other guests have said, and you as well, this war for commodities is very real, and I think these awful murders may kind of signal even an escalation in that war. And the Javari itself is an ecological cultural gem, a treasure that needs to be protected and needs serious protection, because the players involved out there, they arrested a couple of riverine dwellers, ribeirinhos, but there's obviously much more. This is a much bigger. The forces of darkness, if you will, are much more powerful than, some fishermen.
For sure. Yeah, I made that point earlier when the federal police already have announced they claim there was no higher level involvement here, and that strikes me as highly dubious to come that quickly to this conclusion.
I think so too. It's so weird, but actually, Amarildo, the first guy they arrested, he's also happens to be someone I know, because he was on that expedition that I was on, that I wrote about in the Unconquered. He was one of the like 8 or 9 non-indigenous frontiersmen who were on that journey. So it was like really bizarre to see, knowing Bruno, knowing Dom, and then knowing this guy. Just
Wow.
Amazing.
What does that say about the complexities out there? You're reminding me a little bit of when I was in Acre, in 1989, the guys with the chainsaws, many of them were former rubber tappers. And so they were clashing. I was at confrontations where rubber tappers and former rubber tappers were essentially in conflict because of, the poverty and the need for jobs and stuff. Is that the similar dynamic there?
In a way, I think so. I think you have this over, maybe now there's definitely something like that going on. But now I think, in large measure, perhaps because of the geographical location of the Javari, because it's so isolated, because it's a border region where, major drug trafficking route, and because the government has been so negligent in terms of like actually, enforcing the rule of law, like they're, constitutionally obliged to do. This area has been, I think, in a way, you could say that wide swaths of this area have been the sovereignty has been ceded to, cartels, or is in danger of being ceded to cartels. And I think there may well be, we may find out that these fishermen had some connections to those trafficking forces.
Other thoughts from you, Carla, on, you said Manga Bay is doing a series on impunidad. What's driving that, or how far up the chain does that go?
Yeah, no, I mean, I haven't been to Javari Valley, but what we see there is it repeats in many places in the Amazon. They're very remote. There is no enforcement close to that area. I can tell, for example, the Arariboia Reserve in Maranhão, where I did a documentary film. It's a huge area, one of the most threatened indigenous reserves in the country, all surrounded by sawmills. There is still illegal logging. It's demarcated, should be protected, and the crimes keep going. And we don't see, the surveillance there because there is not a FUNAI office close by. There is no IBAMA office. So they're all acting on their own because the illegal loggers keep going. That's why they go to the front line and to risk their lives against this. And so we are doing this series. Some stories focus on other Latin American countries, so these in Spanish and English, and we are doing 3 for Brazil. And the story I'm doing for Brazil is on the case of the murder of Paulo Paulino Guajajara. That's in the documentary film with Bruno Pereira. So, that's really, my mind was really crazy these days. It's all coming together, and then this tragedy happened with Bruno, who was featured in the film. And for example, Paulo was murdered in November 2019. It's been almost 3 years. Nobody has been charged for that. But in that case, and what I'll be telling the story is that for the first time, there will be a popular jury for this case, which the first in Brazil. So this is to be really, really important and can be a milestone for other cases, because for the Guajajara people, for example, following Paulo's murder, other Guajajara were murdered in that area. And the case just, as you say, the coverage is on the case, and then it gets forgotten somehow. So I think we as journalists, you should keep track on these cases, and how it is, when is the trial. But we know that's not an easy task, because the judiciary system is very slow. There are few people, thousands process. For example, I can tell a story that I did for Manga Bay, which was a palm oil investigation, and like we show, the companies that are international sustainable certified, exporting things, and they are polluting the water. There are deforestation claims, a lot of wrongdoing going on. And in that case, for example, the federal prosecutors have been trying to do a forensic investigation in the course of the process to prove the wrongdoing. It's been 8 years. They didn't get it. That's an absurd. And then I asked the prosecutor, but how is that? Oh, there are thousands on the process there. So they also pass other things on the up front to be, to go to the trial. And then it's crazy. And right now, for example, they are using the investigation, the Manga Bay investigation in the case to try to pressure. And these days I talk to the prosecutor, and then how about the trial? Oh, they promised to set up this soon, and then you don't see. So, I mean, it's really, I think the legal system, we need changes on that as well, because, there is all this bureaucracy, the process there. In the meantime, people are dying. either for being murdered or being because of water contamination, you know, and other issues in the region.
Yeah. This, Scott, I wanted to bring you back into, and Lucy, I don't know if you've dealt with this. You dug in quite deeply on this question of genocide. There's an international criminal court petitions that, you know, around the way Bolsonaro has worked so hard to, what he would say, integrate indigenous peoples into society, which is essentially to eliminate them in many ways. Where does that go from here? That's at the highest level.
Lucy, you want to respond to that?
Sure. I mean, yeah, some of the statements that Bolsonaro made before coming to power were absolutely highly racist and reminiscent of genocide. I mean, I think he said that the Brazilian cavalry had been incompetent because, unlike the American cavalry, they had not exterminated the Brazilian indigenous people. And I mean, that is pretty indicative of his general hatred and contempt. I think that, and then obviously with the legislative attempts that he's made to open up demarcated lands to extraction and economic development, and the refusal to demarcate more lands, there is no doubt, there can be no doubt here that what we're seeing is a systematic attempt to entirely remove the rights of indigenous people in Brazil by Bolsonaro. And that really needs to be one of the international focuses as we go on with this story, is keeping that aspect of it, the political context of these murders. Bruno was killed because he was trying to help indigenous people. He had been supplying them with drones and I think some satellite equipment to try and defend themselves. And I think it's probably safe to say that that was the main reason that he was a target. There can be no kind of doubt about why this is happening, and we have a head of government that talks this way, and then these things happen. We have to be very bold in talking about responsibility coming from the top for this. And I think, as Carla said, it's so important that while the stories about the case happen, about this and that, and you know the court reporting going on, we don't lose sight, as in the international community, of the context in which this is happening, the attacks on the environment and indigenous rights. We can hope that Bolsonaro won't be re-elected this year. I won't count my galinas until they're hatched, because things are volatile. But even then, it's harder to backtrack. It's harder to produce new rights than it is to take them away. It's harder to change culture once it's been contaminated in this way. So I think it will take a huge effort, and one which we really need to continue holding people to account for. Yeah, Scott, I mean, you've worked in this region. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. By the way, it may be worth remembering that Bruno also, in one of his final acts as the head of the Department of Isolated Indigenous People within FUNAI, oversaw or helped to coordinate a major operation on the Jutaí River leading out of the Javari Valley Indigenous Reserve, where they blew up many gold dredges that were operating illegally. There was also an alleged massacre that maybe took place on the Jutaí with the Arrow people, os flecheiros, which is the land. Those are the people whose land we crossed on the expedition that I was on. But yeah, I think that, you know, as far as, it's not like we're seeing at this point, you know, the kind of some people will maybe balk at the use of the term genocide, because we've gotten used to, you know, the idea of, I don't know, gas chambers and, you know, tens of thousands. But I think it is a genocide that's going on. The leaders of the movement and of the indigenous people themselves are being selectively targeted. Paulo Paulino in the Guajajara with the Guajajara was you know, a very important member of the Forest Guardians, and great documentary that Carla did. And that situation on the death of Paulino and the fight for the Arariboya forests. So I'm just seeing now that I might have to step off this call in a minute.
Okay.
But yeah. And if I have to go in a flash, my apologies. But I'm still here for the moment, but might not be for much longer.
Yeah, that clash you described with the gold dredges is a powerful example of how, when there is on the ground impact resistance that works, the violence on the other side does ramp up. And if that's not, with all the satellite imagery and all the capacity of indigenous sentinels to send out live reports about illegal activity, if there isn't governance, if there isn't real response, then it's still game over. And as you all said, I think it was Carla very eloquently said, this is, well, you both did, this is a one-way street. You know, it's a demolition of cultures that have been there for millennia, and it just, I know it drives us all a bit crazy. I know.
No, and just to add that I agree that what's going on is genocide and ethnocide, both, because all these attempts, you know, to kill the indigenous culture, to deny this culture, and to also, you know, tie to the series I mentioned I did, Indigenous in the City, for example, there will be the census in Brazil. It should have happened in 2020. It was canceled because of the pandemic. It will happen this year now, expect for August. And the indigenous people, they are doing a huge mobilization for self-declaration as indigenous, because if you look back, and you know, this means these centuries of prejudice of people to declare they are indigenous. For this series, I interviewed many people living in the series that they took decades to know they are indigenous people and to recognize they were. But then, as there were no public policies for them in the cities, they don't recognize themselves in cities. And as there are not too many people as indigenous people, there is a lack of public policy. So, you know, they're trying to break. Yeah, that's the last one. And the last piece, for example, they say the term pardo because pardo is brown. In the Brazil census, there is this term for race. And so many of indigenous people are there as pardo, not as indigenous. So they're doing this huge movement because this is a colonial term. It makes them invisible. So, you know, more than ever, they need to, you know, because right now we have officially less than 1 million indigenous people. But all of the indigenous leaders say this underestimate. For example, in Manaus, the capital of Amazonas state, it doesn't appear in the rank from the last census, neither as an absolute numbers or in, you know, in percentage. And I heard many people who are there on the ground doing research, no, we're knocking on the door. These people are indigenous. Arriving there, they said, no, I'm not indigenous. And then the census people cannot say they are indigenous. So, you know, there is really a lot of things that have to be done, you know. Of course, that at the same time, we see a great movement of, you know, trying to highlight the indigenous culture. And by coincidence, in Manaus, for example, I added a story from a reporter who was there, because during this story, I knew they would set up a memorial and have something in Manaus, because, for example, the Teatro Amazonas, the Amazonas Theater, it was built on the top of an indigenous cemetery. Nobody knew that. For this series, I talked to many historians. They told me things, that because the indigenous history in Brazil is completely buried. And then there is this huge task force of historians all around Brazil through documents and then to bring this history to life. So, I think that is, the history, education, and at the same time, demand accountability from the government and international outcry, and the supply chains, the financial pressure. We do need to do a lot of things because it's really a genocide and ethnocide war against them.
So, Scott, before you go, this is a question for us Nordestinos, not Nordestinos, North Americanos. And Lucy, I guess, as a European, I thought about this a lot in 1989 when I was there. Many Brazilians said, "But you don't have the right to complain about deforestation. You don't have the right to complain about genocide. You've done it all." And are we expecting this is too much? Is there a leapfrogging like we think of with technology? On climate change, what poor countries don't have to repeat our mistakes. People say, is there an ethical leapfrogging that has to happen, or are countries that are resource rich and still developing always going to have this pattern that we had 150, 200 years ago, right up through fairly recently too, with racism?
I think at this point that the canon of international law, what has come to be regarded as acceptable behavior and the norms that govern society have evolved since the 19th century. So I think it's very important to bear that in mind. The other thing is that, the poorer sectors of Brazilian society who are on the frontier regions in the Amazon, there is a case to be made. I do have some sympathy for them, but so much of this, so much of the deforestation, so much of the threatening of the rights of indigenous people and their lands and the violence is really in the service of much larger economic interests, and who, this is really predatory capitalism, and it's not for the most part the small people who are benefiting from the exploitation of the Amazon. It's very large commercial interests.
Yeah, in Peru, there was a researcher at Columbia University, Josh Fisher, working in Peru. They did a very detailed analysis of the gold miners, campesinos who were becoming gold miners, and macroeconomically, they would be better off continuing what they were doing compared to gold mining.
Yeah.
But how do you tell them that, in a way that?
How do you redirect that? Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, a final thought from each of you, Carla and Lucy, and then I'm going to play my favorite song, I think among my top favorite songs in the world ever, by Vital Farias. I'm going to close by the Saga da Amazonia, which captures this all magnificently. But I'd love to have your final thoughts on where we go from here.
I think it's really just in reference to the last question about the patterns which we've played out as Europeans and North Americans. I've had Brazilians say that to me before when I've, soy farmers or, you deforested your land hundreds of years ago. Why do you get to tell us what we do with ours? And also the point that you were making, Scott, about the most impoverished people not benefiting from these huge pressures of international commodities. I mean, the situation in Brazil right now is pretty telling. It's the biggest producer of soy. 15 members of Cargill's family just became billionaires because of the commodity prices going up. And yet Brazil is in the middle of a huge hunger crisis. 20 people have fallen back into extreme poverty. And Brazil is not growing food right now for its own people. There isn't enough food to feed poor Brazilians right now. And yet it is feeding the world's factory chickens and factory farmed pigs. So I think it's a bit of a straw man argument that in many ways, that one. But what I would like to end on is that Dom was writing a book about how to sustainably make, which projects can work in the Amazon to give jobs sustainably for people while not destroying the Amazon. So he really understood that there are impoverished people. The Amazon isn't a big empty forest with some naked indigenous people with their bows and arrows. There are 20 million people living there who need to live. They need a way to live that is an alternative to cutting down trees and illegal extraction of whatever commodities they can sell. And Dom really understood that. And that's why he was writing a book on it. So I think that's where I'll end that.
Well, let's hope that the book in some form or other can emerge.
I hope so.
It's a terrible loss for his family, his closest circles, for the journalistic community that's been so tight-knit around the Amazon. So many tributes. Eliana Broom, Dom Phillips, on and on, you guys. So thanks for being on the show today. Scott, if you're heading down there, good luck and stay safe. And the same for you both in your future endeavors. Lucy, you're moving to DC, still covering Brazilian issues. Carla, that I look forward to that next series. Manga Bay, as I put in the chat, is a true global resource. Without it, the world would be worse off. So I'm really glad that Rhett Butler's vision has, worked. And thank you for being here. And so part of my thank you is just to play. You can, if you have to cut out. But this is Vital Farias wrote this song about the Amazon a long time in 1982, and I first heard it when I was there in Brazil, and it captures so much. And someone put it to with some visuals that are pretty compelling as well. So thanks for being here. Hang in if you want to, just to breathe in this music for a few minutes, and then maybe we can also revisit when that series comes out and your other. Can you hear it? Can you hear it?
Uma vez uma sombra, a mais bonita floresta. Mata verde, céu azul, a mais imensa floresta. No fundo d'águas e aras, caboclo, lendas e mágoas, e os rios puxando as águas. Papagaios, periquitos, cuidavam de suas cores. Os peixes singrando os rios, curumins cheios de amores. Sorria o jurupari, o irapuru, seu povir. Era flora, fauna, frutos e flores. Toda mata tem caipora para mar vigiar. Veio um caipora de fora para a mata definhar e trouxe dragão de ferro pra comer muita madeira, e trouxe estilo gigante pra acabar com a capoeira. Fizeram logo um projeto sem ninguém testemunhar, pra o dragão cortar madeira e toda a mata derrubar. Se a floresta, meu amigo, tivesse pé pra andar, eu garanto, meu amigo, um perigo não tinha ficado lá. O que se corta em segundos gasta tempo pra vingar. o fruto que dá no cacho pra gente se alimentar. Depois tem o passarinho, tem o ninho, tem o ar. Igarapé, rio abaixo, tem riacho e esse rio que é o mar. Mas o dragão continua na floresta a devorar. E quem habita essa mata, pra onde vai se mudar? Corre índio, seringueiro, preguiça, tamanduá, tartaruga, pé ligeiro, corre, corre, tribo dos camaiurá. Mas o dragão continua na floresta a devorar. E quem habita essa mata, pra onde vai se mudar? Corre índio, seringueiro, preguiça, tamanduá, tartaruga, pé ligeiro, corre, corre, tribo dos camaiurá. No lugar que havia mata, hoje há perseguição. Grileiro mata porceiro, só pra lhe roubar seu chão. Castanheiro, seringueiro já viraram até peão. Afora os que já morreram, como a vida e a ribação. Zé de Nana tá de prova, naquele lugar tem cova, gente enterrada no chão. Pois mataram o índio, que matou grileiro, que matou porceiro. Disse um castanheiro para um seringueiro, que um estrangeiro roubou seu lugar. Pois mataram o índio, que matou grileiro, que matou porceiro. Disse um castanheiro para um seringueiro, que um estrangeiro roubou seu lugar. Foi então que um violeiro, chegando na região, ficou tão penalizado e escreveu essa canção. E talvez desesperado com tanta devastação, pegou a primeira estrada, sem rumo, sem direção. Os olhos cheios de água, sumiu levando essa mágoa dentro do seu coração. Foi então que um violeiro, chegando na região, ficou tão penalizado e escreveu essa canção. E talvez desesperado com tanta devastação, ficou a primeira estrada sem rumo, sem direção. Os olhos cheios de água, sumiu levando essa mágoa dentro do seu coração. Aqui termina essa história para a gente de valor, pra gente que tem memória, muita crença, muito amor, pra defender o que ainda resta, sem rodeio, sem aresta. Era uma vez uma floresta na linha do Equador.
Thanks again. Just
Thanks,
pretty
Andy.
magical. Thanks for being here. Good luck with your work. Take care.
Thanks.
This is the Columbia Climate School Sustained Web broadcast, Friday, June 17th, marking the loss of Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira, and where we go from here. Take care, everybody.